My name is Ellen.
Yay!
I am going to introduce our speaker, Richard Holmboe, who I have known for a number of years because we were docents way back. That was 10 years ago. Do you realize that? Anyway, here he is, Richard Holmboe, and he is a docent extraordinaire.
Okay. Thank you, Ellen, and thank you all for being here. Welcome to my talk on Pigeon Point and its people. Thank you, Half Moon Bay History Association, Ellen and the others, for giving me this opportunity to talk on this topic. One request, please. Could you hold your questions till later? I will be pausing for about 5 minutes in the middle of my talk, and I can take questions then, and I will be taking questions at the end of the talk. So I would appreciate if you could do that. Thank you. So Pigeon Point is that place 20 miles south of Half Moon Bay, just below Pescadero, right on Highway 1. It's that place with the tall lighthouse. The information I'm reporting to you is information I gathered during my 6 years as a docent at the Pigeon Point Light Station State Historic Park. Now, Ellen said 10 years. Well, we did get started 10 years ago, but I took 4 years off during COVID. So I'll be honest with you, I've been at it for 6 years. I'm a storyteller, not an historian. I gather facts from real historians and fold them together into stories. I don't consider myself an expert on Pigeon Point, but there's a good chance I know more about it than most of you, and I have checked my facts. So let's just settle in and buckle up, and we have a lot of history to cover, and I hope you find it interesting. Pigeon Point and the land around it has been occupied by many different peoples for perhaps 10,000 years, and particularly, I say, over the last 250 years. And those people include the Native Americans, called Ohlone, Spanish Catholic missionaries, influential Mexicans, American ranchers and other landowners, the U.S. Lighthouse Establishment, which became the Lighthouse Service, the U.S. Coast Guard, and finally, the California State Parks. Now, most of Pigeon Point's history, probably more than 10,000 years, is the story of the Native Americans, the Ohlones. The Ohlones are the 800-pound gorilla in Pigeon Point history. Unfortunately, most of that history is not recorded. And what we know of the people and their culture is often from oral history, from what Westerners have learned from the 1600s forward, and often through archaeology. And all the rest of the peoples inhabiting Pigeon Point occurred in the last 250 years. So humans first crossed the land bridge between Asia and Alaska probably 12 to 15,000 years ago. And those that settled in they migrated south. And those that settled in what is now the San Francisco Bay Area and as far down as Point Sur are called, they were called costeños by the Spanish explorers, meaning coast dwellers, and later Costanoans. But those same people are known today as Ohlones, and that's the name they choose for themselves. Ohlones comprised many small independent groups, and the emphasis is on independent. And the group at Pigeon Point was called Curoste. So Curoste lived in an area a few miles south of today's Pescadero, down to about Año Nuevo Point, 5 miles south of Pigeon Point, and inland to the mountain ridge behind Butano State Park. Spanish explorer Juan Rodriguez Cabrillo first spotted Monterey Bay in 1542, but he did not put into shore. In 1602, Sebastián Vizcaíno, what did he do? He first set foot on the Monterey coast, but it wasn't until 1769 that Spanish explorer Gaspar de Portola first set foot on the San Mateo County coast. Portola landed a party at Año Nuevo Point. Near this landing, he discovered a Quiroste village of about 200 people. Portola named the village Big House Village after the large spherical house of the chief. And this village was along today's White House Creek, between Año Nuevo and Franklin Points, and about 1 mile inland. As an aside, after the Quiroste, Portola continued north and discovered San Francisco Bay, again with the help of other Ohlonies. The Quiroste hunted and fished and gathered vegetation. There were large game in the hills like deer and pigs and bear, and small game in the lowlands like squirrels and rabbits, and lots of seafowl to be had. They fished in the ocean and they gathered shellfish. Occasionally they feasted on a beached whale. And then they gathered acorns and grasses to supplement the meat and fish in their diets. Among Ohlone groups, the Quiroste were rather well-to-do. Their land had two resources that were valued amongst all the Ohlonies. The first was a rich supply of the mineral chert. Chert existed on a reef around Año Nuevo Point. Another resource was a rich supply of the purple olive snails with their olivella shells. These shells were baked white. They were cut and then drilled and strung together. And they were basically the money throughout Ohlone lands. So the Quiroste were like the Ohlonies' mint. They produced and they controlled the supply of money. Well, these resources, along with the protection of the hills to the east and the ocean to the west, made the Quiroste both a rich and a secure Ohlone group. As far as we know, the Quiroste led fairly peaceful lives until 1769 when the Spanish arrived. The Spanish brought soldiers, and they brought missionaries, and they brought disease. The Spanish soldiers forcibly moved, they forcibly moved most of the Quiroste off their lands and over the hill to the Santa Clara Mission, where they were treated like slaves. And that is forced indentured servants. The missionaries wanted to convert them to Catholicism. The Spanish government wanted them acclimated to Spanish culture and to be taught to become workers on their farms and ranches. Well, this slide shows the Santa Clara Mission, apparently with a new contingent of Ohlonies arriving by ox cart. In 1850, before statehood, the U.S. military government in California passed laws that legalized forced indentured servitude and even killing of what they called the Indians without consequence. The net result is that between disease and harsh treatment, very few Ohlonies exist today, and none exist that claim to be strictly from the Quiroste group. Now, notwithstanding what I've just said about harsh treatment, disease was by far the dominant reason for the decline in the local population. So in the late 1700s, Spain colonized Alta California, and that was today's California, Nevada, and Utah, and parts of Arizona, Wyoming, and Colorado. This included Ohlone lands, and Spain turned over much of that land to the Catholic missions. Quiroste land was turned over to Mission Santa Cruz, and they used it as a cattle ranch. In 1821, Mexico, including Alta California, won independence from Spain. In 1834, the Mexican government secularized the missions. They took the land away from the missions and they turned it over to prominent Mexicans in the form of land grants. In 1848, California was ceded to the United States, and the United States honored those Mexican land grants. One such land grant was Rancho Punta del Año Nuevo, the former Mission Santa Cruz cattle ranch. And this land grant included Pigeon Point and stretched north to Pescadero Creek and south to Año Nuevo Point. And this slide shows part of an official San Mateo County map in 1878. And Pescadero is to the north, that is to the left. And Pigeon Point, Franklin Point, Año Nuevo Point are to the south, to the right. Now in 1862, Rancho Punta del Año Nuevo passed into the hands of Loren Coburn of Pescadero. Now Coburn was the largest landowner in San Mateo County, and probably the most despised. He was nasty and ruthless, and he was constantly suing his neighbors for slights both large and small. At one point, Coburn even closed the road through his land between Pescadero and a popular beach, out of spite. And such was the nastiness of Loren Coburn. A lot of interesting information about Loren Coburn is in June Morale's book, The Coburn Mystery. From 1862 to 1898, in Loren Coburn's time, Portuguese whalers from the Azores operated a whaling station on the south-facing sandy beach of Pigeon Point. We now call that sandy beach Whalers Cove. The whalers lived in cabins on the bluff above the cove and hunted gray and humpback whales. Shore whaling like this was a part-time operation. Mostly the whalers tended cattle or crops. However, there was always a lookout on the bluffs, and when they spotted a whale swimming by, the word would go out and two crews would descend upon the beach and launch their boats and try to overtake the whale. Now, if they were lucky, the wounded whale did not attack them. Again, if they were lucky and did kill the whale, it didn't sink to the bottom of the ocean. Then, if they were lucky still, they could haul the whale back to Pigeon Point, where it could be processed for oil and baleen. And baleen is the food filter in the mouths of whales that don't have teeth. Baleen was known as whalebone. It was the plastic of its day. It was both stiff and flexible. It was perfect for such marvels as ladies' corsets. One thing about Pigeon Point today is how fresh and clear the air is as it comes in off the sea. Well, it wasn't that way during the whaling days. One observer of the Pigeon Point operation, New York Tribune writer Albert Evans, said that the blubber was dripping with whale oil and everything around it was saturated with that oil. The stench was so strong that, according to Evans, the whole area was, quote, redolent of the perfume. That meant it stunk. This slide shows Whalers Cove as it was during the whaling days. I've seen these pictures in several online sources, but I did lift these particular views from Half Moon Bay's own historian and author Joanne Simons and her book, Whalers, Wharves, and Warfare. Now, some visitors to the state park ask if the light station is haunted. Well, here's the closest thing to a ghost story that I heard. It was dark and stormy that night in November 1878. The whalers at Pigeon Point were snug in their little cabins, protected from the rain and the wind and the cold, but exposed nonetheless to the sounds of the storm. There was the wailing wind, sounding like lost souls on the sea below. There were the trees swaying and scraping against their houses. It sounded like ghosts trying to get to them, but blocked by the walls and doors. Apparently the ghosts were planning evil in payback for their wretched, half-dead existence on the cold sea. Two ships had wrecked within shouting distance of the whalers in the last 4 years. Almost 40 souls were lost. Some washed ashore. Many more lost to the ocean. Lost but trying to be found, yearning for a proper burial. The whalers believed in ghosts, and they believed in all sorts of horrible things that can befall men, especially on nights like this. In the early morning hours after this fretful discussion, no, we haven't had the discussion yet, Angelo, was talking quietly, but Duart was agitated. He thought he'd seen ghosts rising from the sea that evening, or possibly from the shallow sandy graves of the shipwrecked sailors just down the beach. In the early morning hours after this fretful discussion, Duart heard a rapping at the door. A weak but definite rapping at the front door. He moved cautiously to the door. Full of trepidation, he opened the front door. And what he saw made his blood run cold. What stood in front of him was a naked corpse, all white and gray. The corpse groaned, mumbled the word hell, and then fell forward onto Duart. Duart let out a scream. His body was entangled with the ghost's body. He wriggled, trying to get out from under this creature from the gates of hell. Angelo came with a lantern and untangled the two bodies. Full of agitation, Duart blurted out that this was a corpse, a living dead from hell. Well, Angelo gazed carefully upon the corpse. It was bruised and bleeding. Angelo concluded that this could not be a corpse. Corpses don't bleed. So they wrapped the poor corpse in a blanket and fed him some hot soup. Eventually he came back to life. He said he was a survivor from the wrecked sailing ship Hell Espant that was hauling coal from Australia to San Francisco. The Hellespont had wrecked on the rocks during the night, and sailors needed help. Duart and Angelo awakened the other whalers. They all set out to find the other survivors. They found 6 more, a total of 7 survivors. Unfortunately, 11 of the crew died in the wreck of the Hellespont. Now, there were nearly 50 ghosts on this haunted Pigeon Point. Well, that's mostly a true story. Okay, I'll leave it up to you to decide what's true and what wasn't, but it's mostly true. Okay, now. That'll be better. Okay, Lauren Coburn also leased part of Pigeon Point to be run as a shipping port. This on the south face of the point, right next to the whaling station. The whaling station, Whalers Cove, can be seen right here in the left-hand picture. Now, initially, the shipping port used a chute at the end of a 100-foot pier to slide cargo down to ships. And that chute is, you can see that right here. That chute was blown away in 1885. By 1910, they were using a boom and cable at the end of the pier to load and unload cargo, and even people. And that is shown on the right-hand picture. So here's the cable, loading cargo onto a ship. Typical cargo at Pigeon Point were lumber, grain, produce, and dairy products. Years before, back in 1848, the gold rush increased ship traffic up the treacherous coast of California to San Francisco, and shipwrecks were the natural consequence of the increased traffic. In 1853, Pigeon Point was still known as Whale Point, translated from the Spanish Punta de la Ballena. A brand new clipper ship named Carrier Pigeon, perhaps the fastest ship on the water, was about to complete her maiden voyage. She was 15,000 miles from her Boston home as she rounded the Horn of South America, and she was 50 miles from her destination of San Francisco. Carrier Pigeon had been mired in California's coastal fog for several days, and her captain had no idea how close he was to those rocks at the end of Whale Point until he was upon them. No one died in the wreck of the Carrier Pigeon, but the ship was a total loss. And salvage laws said that if you could get things off a wrecked ship, you could keep them or be rewarded for them. So people would run down to the point saying they were headed to Carrier Pigeon's Point. And before long, it simply became known as Pigeon Point. Between 1865 and 1868, 3 shipwrecks produced an outcry that resulted in the light station being built at Pigeon Point. And the shipwrecks were Sir John Franklin, 12 dead. Koya, 26 dead. And the aforementioned Hellespont, 11 dead, for a total of 49 dead. Again, Joanne Simone's book, Shipwrecks, Scallywags, and Scavengers, is a good source of shipwreck information for this part of the coast. Deciding to build the light station at Pigeon Point was no small thing. Ultimately, it took nearly 20 years to get it decided and built. Neither Spain nor Mexico built any lighthouses in Alta California. In 1849, the U.S. Coast Survey Office recommended 10 lighthouses to be built along the California coast, including 4 around the entrance to San Francisco Bay. But, and these were built in the 1850s, but a 90-mile stretch from the bottom of Monterey Bay to San Francisco was left unprotected. And after the carrier Pigeon wreck in 1853, the Coast Survey began looking seriously at that coast between Santa Cruz and San Francisco. The survey recommended a light and a steam whistle to be placed on Año Nuevo Point. Pigeon Point was not even considered until 2 years later, and at that time then it was between Pigeon Point and Año Nuevo Point. Then the office added Año Nuevo Island into the mix. The Civil War took place, and then the 3 shipwrecks that I just mentioned on the last slide. Pigeon Point, let's see here. Año Nuevo was typically the first landfall for ships sailing across the ocean. That spoke for a light station there. But Pigeon Point had the advantages of providing a hard rock foundation and being higher and having a protected boat landing. In 1870, after a lot of haggling with Loren Coburn, the Lighthouse Board bought Año Nuevo Island and the outer parts of Pigeon Point. And the outer part means that it did not include the shipping port or the whaling station. And only then did they decide and make the final decision about where to build. And they decided to build only a steam whistle on Año Nuevo Island and a steam whistle and light at Pigeon Point. So Pigeon Point's steam whistle was operational in 1871. Its lighthouse was activated for the first time in November 15, 1872, which is why Pigeon Point has an anniversary festival every year on the Saturday closest to November 15th. Then, and just to complete the thought, Año Nuevo Island got a steam whistle in 1871, but it wasn't until 1890 that they got a light. And all of this is covered in great detail in Frank Perry's book, The History of Pigeon Point Lighthouse. Now this slide shows the original steam whistle at Pigeon Point. Its boiler took about 45 minutes to build up the head of steam needed to blow the whistle. That meant that the lighthouse keepers had to anticipate the incoming fog and get the fire going early. The fire consumed about a cord of firewood every 10 hours. Now, to give you some perspective as to how much firewood was burned for the steam whistle, this man is standing with a cord of firewood, 10 hours worth. And here's what 90 cords of firewood looks like, a typical winter's worth. This picture from Frank Perry's History of the Pigeon Point Lighthouse shows a huge stack of firewood in front of the fog signal building. And here, that big stack is circled. In this picture, it looks like a long black wall. That come across?
Yeah.
In its first year with only a steam whistle, Pigeon Point had 3 keepers. In 1873, after the light went into operation, the complement of lighthouse keepers increased to 4. In that first year, 1871, Pigeon Point had this 2-story house for the 3 keepers and their families, and then 4 families, and that then became a bit of a squeeze. In 1906, 35 years later, a second duplex was built that resulted in 4 very comfortable dwellings. And Pigeon Point was a desirable station in the lighthouse service. And that was because it was fairly close to populated areas. A man's family could be with him, including his wife and children, and the children could go to a local school. They did have one complaint about the Pigeon Point station. Remember the shore whalers? Well, the place stunk. of boiling whale oil and decaying carcasses, and that part just wasn't so good. In 1939, responsibility for all U.S. lighthouses transferred from the Lighthouse Service to the U.S. Coast Guard. Consolidating two services in one was part of Congress and President Franklin Roosevelt's plan to make government more efficient. Then in 1960, the Coast Guard tore down the two Victorian duplexes and built these 4 bungalows. Now here's a little bit of lighthouse trivia. The house on the left was for the most junior lighthouse keeper. The house on the right was for the most senior keeper. Why was that? Well, as you moved from left to right, you moved farther away from the foghorns, and rank had its privileges. Landowner Lauren Coburn died in 1918 during the Spanish flu pandemic. And at that time, shipping was giving way to trucking for moving cargo up and down the coast. Thus, the shipping port at Pigeon Point shut down in the early 1920s. However, the port's facilities were not entirely idle. Enter the rum runners. In 1920, the 18th Amendment went into effect and Prohibition began. No one was allowed to buy or sell or transport alcoholic beverages. And shortly thereafter, the follow-on Volstead Act made it illegal to possess liquor, except for medicinal and religious purposes. Thus, effectively, no one was allowed to drink. But of course, a lot of people did. And there was a brisk trade in illegal booze, and much of the high-quality liquor came up from Mexico or down from Canada on ships. And those ships would stop just beyond the 3-mile limit in international waters, and they'd load their liquor onto small, fast boats, and those boats would bring the cargo into places like Pigeon Point in the dark of night. And all this trafficking by sea of illegal liquor was called rum running. The rum runners even used the hoisting rigs at Pigeon Point to load the cargo up onto trucks. Then it was driven to San Francisco. Now, I told this story to Ron Duart, the patriarch at the time of Duart's Tavern in Pescadero. And Ron nodded his head to the facts that I told him, and he said, yes, and he says, a lot of that liquor came right here to his family's establishment, Duart's Tavern. In fact, he said in 1926, a big fire swept through Pescadero, burning most of the buildings, and the volunteer fire department gave special care to rescue Duart Tavern bar. Even though the tavern itself burned down, they rescued the bar. And that bar is still used today in the current Duart's Tavern. In 1925, Pilgrim was a rum-running sailing schooner with a 2-man crew. Pilgrim was trying to tie up at Pigeon Point to offload illicit cargo when it ran onto the rocks directly beneath the lighthouse tower. And though the 2 crewmen nearly drowned trying to rescue their cargo, neither died nor was seriously injured. And finally, in 1933, the 21st Amendment repealed the 18th Amendment and nullified the Volstead Act, and that closed a colorful, albeit infamous, chapter in California coastal history and Pigeon Point. So here's a paragraph from the Lighthouse Digest, quote, "There is often only basic information available about the use of lighthouses during wartime, especially during World War I and World War II. In most cases, there is only little information telling us that a lighthouse was used as a lookout tower. This part of lighthouse history needs to be researched more thoroughly," unquote. Now, with that said, I add that I have had difficulty finding any information about Pigeon Point Light Station during World War II. I did find a first-person description from 1990 of one man's experience in the Coast Guard at Pigeon Point during that time. His name was Sid Cheshire. And he said, "The Coast Guard operated 2 additional teams at Pigeon Point during the war. One was a 4-man coastal lookout unit. This unit operated 24/7 and reported on all ship and aircraft movements in the area. Obviously, enemy ships and aircraft were their primary concern. The second unit was a 20-man beach patrol unit. And this unit patrolled beaches at night using dogs and horses. The mission of the mounted patrol was to look out for enemy ships, report and or prevent enemy landings, and to stop communication between enemy ships and agents on shore. According to Joanne Simone's book, Whalers, Wharves, and Warfare, the lighthouse at Pigeon Point went dark at the beginning of the war. How long that lasted is not clear to me. Now, this is the halfway point in my talk, and I'll take questions for about 5 minutes, and there'll be more time for questions at the end of the talk, and if you're bored with my talk, this is a great time to sneak on out. However, I will tell you that I think the second half is better than the first half. Okay, so if there's any questions. Okay.
Did the shore whalers pay Lauren Coburn for the lease of that land?
Who's asking the question? Oh, okay. You know, I don't know. Now, the shore whaling operation started in 1862. Lord Coburn purchased the land in 1862. It stands to reason that it was his land, that he was leasing it to the whaling company. But I've never found anything, any documented history that says, yes, Lauren Coburn leased. And that's why I spoke about it the way I did.
Yeah. And given so many deaths due to shipwrecks along that coast, has there ever been a cemetery in or around Pigeon Point?
Of sorts. In fact, I think it was in 1980, there was a hiker on Pigeon Point, on the beach along near Franklin Point, which is between Año Nuevo and Pigeon Point. And he was hiking along and he looked down and he saw a skull. And it turned out it was from a shallow, sandy grave of some of the shipwrecked sailors. But it was my understanding that it only amounted to 4 or 5, a very small number of sailors that were buried there. So then archaeologists dug up the bones and studied them and put them into a nice new box of some sort, reburied them at Franklin Point under a boardwalk, and they're there today.
Unmarked.
Unmarked, yes. Yes, ma'am.
Where did all that firewood come from?
It came from the hills. There were lumber companies that provided the firewood. Now you should know that as well as I. Am I right?
I was just thinking what people might want to know.
Okay. Yes, ma'am.
I know about fog horns, but a whistle, what is the difference and when did they go to a fog horn?
Okay. Now I'm going to have a little bit of trouble with this. The fog whistle was powered by steam. It was like a ship's whistle or a train whistle, and that's why they called it a whistle. It was just what it was. It was like a train whistle. Okay. Then they had a siren at one point, and I think it was electric, but I'm not sure. They had 2 horns at different points, and they were in and out of service at different times. I can't tell you the dates. I told you I'm not an expert at Pigeon Point.
When did electricity come to the point?
When did electricity come to the point? 1926, and I'll cover that in a little bit.
For the lens for the lighthouse there, I've heard that lens and also the one for Point Arena kind of came around the horn at about the same time, but because Point Arena is a very similar structure though, quite north.
In the very same time frame, both Point Arena and Pigeon Point were built. So they were both built around 1872. They were virtually identical as far as the tower went. So you remember that the Pigeon Point Tower is kind of a cone, so is Point Arena.
Yeah.
But both of them felt the shaking of the 1906 earthquake. Pigeon Point seemed to get through it without any problem. But Point Arena was broken to the point that they could not repair it. So they tore it down and they built another lighthouse. Looked just like a chimney. And it turns out the two of them are the same height, 115 feet tall, which makes them tied for the tallest lighthouses on the west coast. Yes, ma'am.
I'd like to clarify about the indigenous of the peninsula. Ohlone term refers to over a half a dozen different tribal groups and languages throughout the San Francisco and Monterey Bay area. And the indigenous people today of the San Francisco Peninsula are currently referred to as Ramaytush.
Ramaytush. Now, did everybody, well, I'm going to repeat some of that, if I may, for the sake of the video recording. You're telling me that all of what I said were all the Ohlones. They weren't called, they don't all call them that. Now, what I've heard and what I've read is that, first of all, Ohlone is a term they choose for themselves. And it came from the name of one of the groups, as I recall. But nonetheless, it's a name that they choose for themselves today. Now, Ramaytush,
I am a Ramaytush descendant.
Okay, well, you see now, I can't dispute what you're saying.
From the village of Mintock along Clara Creek in Pacifica. And Ramaytush is a Chichenyo word from the East Bay. And Ramay in the Chichenyo language is west. So from the perspective of the East Bay, people of the peninsula are referred to the people of the west.
Okay, now, I can't repeat all of that, and I can't dispute any of it. So I'm going to take your word from it because you're closer to all of this than I am by far.
And the term Ohlone is thought to be taken from, at the time that the Portola expedition came and landed at Año Nuevo Point, they disembarked and went on foot up to what is now San Gregorio. Holmboe is the tribal band area there. And the crew members of the Portola expedition were very ill with scurvy, and they were nursed back to health there in that valley of San Gregorio, and were fed seed cakes, which were very high in vitamin C, and they revived and was able to continue on their journey.
May I interrupt you, please? Thank you very much for that information. I hope the people here in the room heard it, and it's valuable information, but now we are straying away from Pigeon Point.
Well,
So I do have
I'm talking
to,
about the term Ohlone and
I hear what you're saying.
come from. So given the Ohlone and putting a Spanish plural on it, it's thought that that was the origin of the.
Okay, I can't dispute the origins. So thank you very much. Now, I do have to move along if we're going to finish this on time. So, folks, this is the crown jewel of Pigeon Point. It's the first order Fresnel lens, and it is magnificent. It is a Fresnel lens because it's made up of many small prisms instead of just one massive piece of glass. It's a first order because it's the biggest kind they made. It's a first order. Now, the bigger the lens, the brighter the light, the farther it can be seen out to sea. And so that's why they put the first order lens on places like Pigeon Point, where you're right on the ocean and there's a lot of ship traffic. And as visitors enter the park's fog signal building, they often let out an audible wow. And that's when they first gaze upon the lens. Now, the lens used to be up in the tower, and it provided the light for the ships at sea. For over 100 years it operated at Pigeon Point. The lens itself is about 9 feet tall, and it sits on a 3 or 3.5 foot stand, and those 12 feet are what you see when you come into the Pigeon Point. The complete system, including the lens, the stand, and its pedestal, is about 17 feet tall. The Pigeon Point lens is actually 24 Fresnel lenses, where each of these vertical columns of glass is a separate Fresnel lens. And for one light bulb inside, there are 24 beams of light coming out of the lens. And when you see pictures like this, that's what it really looked like if you were standing close to the tower. You would see all 24 beams of light. Now, if you were a ship out at sea, you only see the beam pointing at you. And in other parts of the ocean, you may not see anything at all, unless that pinwheel of light was rotating and sweeping across the ocean. And so it did, and it rotated very slowly to produce a flash of white light for any ship on the ocean every 10 seconds. And how did they do that rotation? Well, they took everything that you see here, 2,500 pounds of glass and bronze and iron, and they rotated this around the stationary light bulb. And how did they rotate the lens and do it so precisely back in those early days? They used a clock, a geared device, not unlike the clock on the wall. And just like that clock on the wall that moves its hands to the proper time, well, this clock moved the lens around to produce that one flash of white light every 10 seconds. So, what powered the clock? Well, the clock was powered like a grandfather clock, with a descending weight on a cable. The weight was 80 pounds, and you can see it here in the cutaway model. Now, as the weight descended, the cable pulled a drum around that moved all the gears. And the weight was only raised to the first landing on the staircase. And then it descended 25 feet over the course of 4 hours, all the while turning the lens. And when it got to the bottom in the foundation, well, the lighthouse keeper standing next to the clock would wind it back up again, raising the weight to the first landing. Then he was good for 4 more hours of operation. Now here's a short video that illustrates the rotating lens, the clockwork mechanism and the descending weight. The video does not show the Pigeon Point light, it's simply a demonstration. Now here you get a sense of a flash of light every time one of those vertical columns of glass is facing right at you. And here we begin to see the descending weight on the cable. And the cable pulls that drum round and round, which makes all the other gears turn. You see those rotating paddles up high? Those paddles are part of the timekeeping part of the clock. That's part of the centrifugal governor. Now this is an awfully good looking clock and lens. If this was ever a real lighthouse lens, it would have been the very smallest kind, what we would have called a 6th order lens. And for light in those earliest days, they had a very elaborate candle. That first candle had 4 concentric wicks, that is, one within the other. And each wick had a lot of air around it, which made the burn very bright and very efficient. And what did they burn? They burned lard, pig fat. They kept the lard in that little watch house at the bottom of the tower in the room circled on the slide. The oil room had a fireplace to heat the lard to liquefy it before carrying it up the 146 steps in a can like the one shown here on the right. And about 2 gallons was what they used for a short summer's night, and maybe 3 gallons for a long winter's night. That loaded can probably weighed 30 plus pounds as they carried it up the 146 steps. In 1888, the lard lamp was replaced by a kerosene lamp, and in 1926, the lighthouse was electrified. An electric motor replaced the clock, A 1,000 watt incandescent light bulb replaced the kerosene lamp. The beam from that electric light could be seen 22 miles away. 22 miles on a clear night. On a foggy night, probably not at all. Well, that was why they had the need for a fog signal. First a steam whistle, then some sirens, and then some horns. And the fog signals could be heard maybe 5 miles away. Not 26 miles like the light, but 5 miles away. So imagine yourself a ship's captain in the 1800s sailing on an old wooden ship. Your navigation was primitive at best, and you've been caught in the fog for days, and you weren't really sure how close you were to the rocky coast. And then you hear the Pigeon Point fog signal. And that's when you realize you are somewhere within 5 miles of those rocks at the end of Pigeon Point. You're in a heap of trouble. Those rocks are killers. They will wreck any ship that goes on them. You better check your compass and steer west really quickly. Get back out to sea. Well, that describes the whole purpose of the light station. With its light and its fog signals, was to keep ships off those rocks and to help them navigate in and out of San Francisco Bay. Now I'd like to introduce you to two of the most influential people relative to the Pigeon Point Fresnel lens. And the first is Auguste Fresnel himself, the inventor of this kind of lens. Fresnel placed his first lens in a lighthouse in France in 1822. And it was such an improvement over all light sources before it, maybe 5 times brighter, that within 100 years, 10,000 lighthouses around the world had Fresnel lenses. Then it was Auguste Henri, the man on the right. Auguste Henri, and later Henri Lepaute, whose company built the Pigeon Point lens. The lens, its pedestal, and the clock. Now, this is just a personal anecdote. I was telling the story of the lens one time several years ago, and a young woman was standing across the floor from me, and she wasn't part of the group. And when the group dispersed, she came up to me and she said her name was Camille Henri Lepaute, and she was the 4th great-granddaughter of Auguste. Now, I was really excited to hear that. I don't think I would have been more thrilled if somebody came up and said they were Abraham Lincoln's 4th great-granddaughter. And I was so impressed, and I told my boss at the time, Half Moon Bay's Julie Barrow in the state parks, and Julie said, well, that's great. Did you get contact information on her? I said, no, I was too excited and I didn't think to ask. And she said, well, did you find out anything about the Henri Lepaute company? And I said, no. So I wasn't much of a researcher back then. Now I'm going to take a little different direction now. Here's a story about the Pigeon Point lens and how it served in the Civil War. The Civil War started in 1861. The Confederacy had about 100 lighthouses along their eastern and Gulf coasts, including the first order light at Cape Hatteras, North Carolina. Now remember, a first order light is the biggest and brightest. The Confederate government recognized that lighthouses were more important to the North than the South. The North had a navy at the beginning of the war, the South had none. And the North had a strategy of blockading southern ports to prevent them from getting assistance from the outside. So the North needed those lighthouses to help them find the safe channels and to block those channels. Well, so the Confederate government ordered all lighthouses to be turned off and, if possible, disassembled. The order included the first order light at Cape Hatteras. Now, Cape Hatteras needed that first order light perhaps more than any other lighthouse in the country. I know 12 shipwreck stories around Pigeon Point. Cape Hatteras has 600 shipwreck stories. In fact, it's known as the graveyard of the Atlantic. Cape Hatteras pokes out into the Atlantic like a big wart. Now, I don't mean that in any disparaging way, it's just the way it looks. Then there's the Labrador Current that sweeps down from Canada, and the Gulf Stream that comes up from the Gulf of Mexico and they both come together at Cape Hatteras. Now ships like to ride those currents because they can go faster, but any ship that doesn't see the Cape is bound to run into them, either the island, the Cape, or its diamond shoals. Now the diamond shoals are about 10 or 15 miles of sandbars that project out from the island itself. And any ship that runs into the island or into those diamond shoals is a wreck. And 600 did. Okay, so the Union Navy wanted that first order Fresnel light turned back on, and so immediately in 1861, they sent an army unit down to Cape Hatteras, and they retook the island and they got the lighthouse back. And when they scaled the steps of the lighthouse, they found that the Confederate Army had disassembled, removed, and hidden the light. Well, the Union was desperate. Now, the top of any lighthouse, that glass part with the lens in it, is called the lantern room. With that in mind, the Union Army hung lanterns in the lantern room. Well, that wasn't good enough. So then the Union Army shipped down a second order Fresnel lens, and they installed that at Cape Hatteras. Now a second order lens is about 2/3 the size of a first order lens. Thus it's not as bright, and it was not adequate. So then the Union ordered a brand new first order lens from the Henri Lepaute Company in Paris, France, and it came and they installed it in 1863. And that lens ultimately became the Pigeon Point lens. That lens served during the Civil War at Cape Hatteras in the last 2 years, spanning the years 1863, 64, and 65, and it continued operating at Cape Hatteras until 1870. Now in 1870, the war was over. Lighthouse Board was back in charge, and all the lighthouses were turned back on. The Lighthouse Board decided that the 150-foot tower at Cape Hatteras, built right on the sand, was not tall enough. And by the way, the Pigeon Point Tower is 115 feet tall, but it's built on a 50-foot rock. And so actually the Pigeon Point light is higher than the Cape Hatteras light was. So needing a taller tower, they built the 200-foot tower at Cape Hatteras. It was the tallest lighthouse in America, and to this very day, it remains the tallest. Once the tall tower was complete, they faced a decision. They could save money by dismantling the light in the short tower and rebuilding it in the tall tower. But that would take weeks, and it would shut down the light for weeks, and they didn't want to do that, not at the graveyard of the Atlantic. And so what they did instead was they ordered a new light to be installed in the tall tower. And they did that in 1870. And then one day they could shut down the light in the short tower. That night they could turn on the light in the tall tower, and they never missed a night of light. Okay? Only then could they dismantle the light in the short tower and send it on a sailing ship around the Horn of South America and brought it to Pigeon Point to become Pigeon Point's light in 1872. Now, so that's our Civil War story as far as we go, but it continues for Cape Hatteras. Cape Hatteras was left with a mystery. Now, we believe they had 3 lights. The first light was in the short tower, the light that in 1861 the Confederate Army took and hid. The second light in the short tower that was installed in 1863, well, that became the Pigeon Point light. And then finally, the third light was installed in the tall tower in 1870. So, what was the mystery? Well, the mystery was what became of the first light, the one dismantled and hidden by the Confederate Army. Well, it took 132 years to solve that mystery. In 2002, historian Kevin Duffus, author of the book The Lost Light, discovered a letter in the National Archives. The letter was dated 1870, the date of the tall tower. It was from the Lighthouse Board to the lighthouse keepers at Cape Hatteras, and the letter said the light they were receiving for their tall tower is the same one taken and hidden by the Confederate Army in 1861. So there were really only 2 lights, theirs and Pigeon Point's. And here's what happened. after the war, the hidden lens was found almost immediately. And they knew they found the Cape Hatteras light because everything was labeled. But remember, the Cape Hatteras Lighthouse was now working quite well with the light they installed in 1863. So they gathered up all the pieces and they sent them back to the manufacturer, Henri Lepaute, in Paris, where they were restored. And Henri Lepaute then sent it back to the Lighthouse Board's warehouse on Staten Island in New York. And then in 1870, when Cape Hatteras needed a new light, they shipped their old light back to them, along with that letter that I just mentioned. Okay? But at that point in time, somewhere along the way, and for some reason, institutional memory was wiped clear. And for 132 years, people would scratch their heads and say, yes, but whatever happened to that missing light? Now, I find all of this to be somewhat interesting, but it all ends in a sad way. In 1937, the Cape Hatteras Lighthouse was shut down, and for several years it was abandoned. And during that time, vandals got in and broke or stole a lot of the lens. So, what you see today at the graveyard of the Atlantic Museum on Hatteras Island in North Carolina is just a shadow of its former grandeur, a mere birdcage without glass. Compare that to the lens that still exists at Pigeon Point. At Pigeon Point, you see 100% of its original glass. It has real wow factor. It's dazzling. It really is a work of art. Now, here's one last funny little story about Cape Hatteras before I get back to Pigeon Point. So the light was shut down in 1937, and it left dormant until 1949. At that time, the Coast Guard wanted to dismantle the lens in the tower and move it over to a warehouse for safekeeping. The Coast Guard sailors who did the dismantling would play a little game at the end of the day. They'd stand up on the top of the tower and they'd fling nuts and bolts from the lens into the sea. And whoever threw his nut or bolt the farthest, well, he didn't have to buy drinks that night. It was something like that. Then in 2004, when the National Park Service wanted to build up the lens again and put it into the graveyard of the Atlantic Museum, of course they found a lot of nuts and bolts were missing. And worse than that, they also found that the threads on the connectors were not metric, nor were they US standard. They were part of a system that was cut according to a system called Pedra, or Ped Roy, where the foot of the king was the basic unit of measure, and all other measurements, like the threads on the nuts and bolts, were derived from the king's foot. Well, the museum had to spend a lot of money to fabricate new nuts and bolts. Okay, so now we're back to Pigeon Point. In 1974, the large Fresnel light at Pigeon Point was shut down after 102 years of operation. An automatic rotating arrow beacon was put into operation. The foghorns were set to run continuously, and the last lighthouse keeper, a young sailor, a Coast Guard sailor named Jerry Jolly, left Pigeon Point. The lighthouse was completely automated. In 1976, the foghorns were shut down. Pigeon Point was silenced. Also in 1976, another young Coast Guard sailor named Sandy Tucker was assigned to Pigeon Point. And though his job title was lighthouse keeper, he did not operate the lights or foghorns. He cared for the grounds and the buildings. Now everybody enjoys this story about Sandy Tucker's pig, Lester, and it is real Pigeon Point history. My wife and I had lunch with Sandy Tucker several years ago, and he told us this story. So here's the story. One of Sandy Tucker's responsibility was to keep out trespassers. There used to be a sign in front that says, "Do not enter." And the trespassers would come up, they'd read the sign, they'd go, "Pooah," and then they'd walk in and commit vandalism. Now, the worst vandalism that ever happened at Pigeon Point that we're aware of took place during Sandy Tucker's time. Sandy and his wife were driving home one night. Now, home was Pigeon Point. They lived in that first lighthouse keeper's house, the senior keeper's house. And what they saw was a big fire at Pigeon Point, And they thought, geez, one of the houses is burning down. But when they got there, they found a whole bunch of trespassers who tore down 200 feet of wooden fence, and they used that wood to build a big bonfire, and they were having a party around the bonfire. But they destroyed 200 feet of government property. Sandy Tucker went out and got a fierce watchdog. He got a Doberman Pinscher. Now, let's see where I'm supposed to be here. This dog was so fierce that it frightened Sandy Tucker, and it frightened Sandy's wife, and it frightened Sandy's little girl. But for some reason, it did not frighten the trespassers. Like, they'd come up to the sign, they'd read it, and they'd go pooah, and they'd walk in, and the dog would growl at them, and they'd say, be quiet. And they'd walk on in and commit vandalism. Well, now, this dog frightened Sandy Tucker, and frightened Sandy's wife, and frightened Sandy's little girl. If it didn't frighten the trespassers, he got rid of the dog. Now, Sandy and his wife raised farm animals at Pigeon Point. They had horses and chickens and goats. And one day they went out and they bought a little pig. They bought a little pig and they named him Lester. And Lester was so small that Lester was sitting on Sandy's lap as he was driving him home from where we got him. And he said Lester was piggy bank size. Okay? Now, Lester was, let's see, he was piggy bank size. But he grew to be 800 pounds. Now, most pigs grow to be about 250 pounds, and then they become bacon and sausage and stuff. But a pig is an animal that if you let it, it never stops growing. And Lester was a Duroc pig. That was his breed. He was a Duroc pig. And the largest Duroc pig on record was 1,200 pounds. Now, Lester wasn't quite that big, but at 800 pounds, Lester was a big pig. Okay? And Lester was a nice pig, and he was a curious pig. So if you came to the gate at Pigeon Point and he heard you, he's going to come out to see you, see who you are. Now, can you imagine what you'd feel like if 800 pounds of Lester was coming right at you? If I tell this to kids, and I tell this story to kids most of the time, and I'll say, would you be frightened by Lester? And they'd say, no. Half of them would say, no. And so then I continue. Lester was a Duroc pig. A Duroc pig's ears do not stand straight up. They flop down over his eyes. He can't see very well. So now he's 800 pounds coming at you, and he might run you over because he can't see you. And then there's one other thing that I did not know this about domestic pigs. They grow tusks, just like the wild pigs do. And farmers often cut them off because they're dangerous. Sandy Tucker didn't know to do that. So now you got 800 pounds of Lester coming at you. Maybe he'll run into you, and he's got tusks. And then I asked the kids, would you be afraid then? Half of them still say no. And then I show them this picture that I call Lester the pig. Well, now this is really not Lester the pig. This is that 1,200-pound record Duroc that I told you about. And I use this picture because of the little girl standing next to the pig, and you get a sense of how big a pig can be. Do you see how the ears flop down over his eyes? And how about the tusks? Well, I put the tusks in with Photoshop. Well, you can't find a picture of a big pig with a little girl and with tusks. So I got the tusks off a picture of a wild pig, I put it in here, and I've had pig farmers tell me, yeah, that's close to what it looks like. So I tell you that this is close to what Lester looked like. And except for that, all this story about Lester the pig is true, and that is, if even inconsequential, it is part of Pigeon Point history. Now, in 2001, now we're not talking about Lester anymore. In 2001, Pigeon Point Light Station belonged to the Coast Guard, and that cast iron belt, what's it called, a belt course, that held the bricks together up high, had been exposed to moist salt air for 130 years. And just after Christmas, 2 large pieces of that rusted through and fell. And as they fell, they took a lot of bricks with them. And the belt course was no longer holding the bricks together up high. And then worse than that, you had all the weight of the lantern room and the lens and its pedestal and everything. And so the Coast Guard had to stop taking people up into the tower. And these are two pieces of that belt course that fell off on the left and the right. And each one of them is about 1.5 by 3 feet, and each weighs several hundred pounds. In 1980, the Coast Guard leased the 4 lighthouse keepers' houses to the California State Parks. And the state turned around and sublet those houses to American Youth Hostels. In 1981, the houses had been converted into low-cost dormitory-style accommodations for overnight guests. And today, the dormitory style is still used, but some rooms are reserved for families, and some of the houses are rented out to groups. In May of 2005, the Coast Guard transferred ownership of the entire light station to California State Parks, creating the new Pigeon Point Light Station State Historic Park. And California State Historic Parks help to preserve much of this diverse heritage, to educate the public, and to make the state past accessible to Californians of all backgrounds. Now, restoring this important landmark is much more now than just fixing the rusted out belt course. All ironwork, all brickwork, windows and paint will be restored or replaced. The 2 upper levels of the tower, the outer decks and the spiral staircase, are all cast iron. Most of the rest of the tower is brick. Scaffolding and netting have been constructed, as you see in the picture here. Scaffolding and netting have been constructed now to allow the contractors to safely remove lead paint. The walls and chimneys of this little watch house at the bottom of the tower are going to be seismically strengthened. The goal is to return the first order Fresnel lens to the tower and make it functional for display only. The working light will be an automatic LED light. Restoration work began in earnest in January of this year, 2024, and full restoration is expected to take 2 or 3 years. The park, its museum, and gift shop remains open during the restoration. Now, the restoration will allow the tower to be reopened and provide rich educational opportunities to the hundreds of thousands of students, tourists, and guests of the hostel who visit Pigeon Point every year. Finally, Half Moon Bay's Julie Barrow is the on-site representative of the state parks regarding all aspects of the restoration work, as well as the lead in developing plans for post-restoration plans. Now, this is the entrance sign to Pigeon Point Light Station State Historic Park, and I'd like to draw your attention to that paragraph that is circled. It says, quote, "A light still stands watch every night and continues to guide mariners safely to port," unquote. Well, that just isn't true anymore. In March of this year, 2024, after 152 years of light, Pigeon Point went dark. The automatic LED light had to be removed to enable the restoration. The automatic light will be returned and activated at the end of the restoration, expected in 2026 or 27. And this is the natural endpoint of my story. But you've seen the thread of Pigeon Point history, its land and its people, from the Native Americans, the Curoste, the Spanish missionaries, and particularly Mission Santa Clara, where the Curoste were sent, and Mission Santa Cruz that received Curoste land from the Spanish government. Mexico and its land grants, including Rancho Punta del Año Nuevo, the former Mission Santa Cruz cattle ranch. U.S. ranchers and landowners like Lauren Coburn, who bought Rancho Punta del Año Nuevo. And some notable shipwrecks, the U.S. Lighthouse establishment that bought some of Pigeon Point from Lauren Coburn and built the light station. The U.S. Coast Guard that continued to operate the light station into modern times, and finally, the California State Parks, whose mission it is to preserve the heritage of Pigeon Point and to educate the public of its significance. Then this my last slide shows many of the books I've used over the years and recently to formulate my talk. Many of these books are available at the Pigeon Point gift shop and online at Amazon. And I'm going to keep this slide up now while I take any questions you might have.
Thank you.
The timing of the lenses, it was, I think, 12 seconds between each flash.
10 seconds between each flash.
Also, there was timing in the horns too, the fog horns. Does the timing correspond to the specific light station?
Yes. Yeah, so the timing of the foghorns, the timing of the light was unique to the lighthouse. Do we have to cut this off? Oh, okay. Throughout its entire history, Pigeon Point has had the very same characteristic for the lights, one flash every 10 seconds. Over the years, as they went from a fog whistle to the steam whistle to the siren to the foghorns, they had different characteristics. The last one was 3 seconds on, 3 seconds off, 3 seconds on, 51 seconds off, so that was the characteristic for a minute. And it was kind of synchronized in a sense with the whistle or the siren, the horns at Año Nuevo Point, so that Año Nuevo Point would give their blast in those 51 seconds of silence. But it was different, they had different characteristics over the years.
I have a question on that. Did you hear anything about geologists say how long that land around the lighthouse will stay, because a lot of lighthouse being moved. The Monterey lighthouse moved inward. Boston lighthouse moved to 20 feet inland. So I'm concerned. I mean, even you renovate all that, but I heard every year about 10 feet of the land eroded into the ocean. So that is quite close to the ocean. So do you hear anything about that?
I think that figure that you've heard is wrong. I think that the Pigeon Point Lighthouse is built on hard rock, and it has not been eroding in that sense. I suppose it erodes somewhere, but nothing like that. And it is not in danger of being problematic. Now, remember, we're talking about the Cape Hatteras Light. They were built right on the sand. And as the sand eroded, then they actually had to move that 200-foot tall tower in about a mile or a quarter mile or something like that. But no, that's not a problem with Pigeon Point. Yes, ma'am.
According to what you said, then, the lighthouse keeper, his job was a 24-hour job. Every 4 hours, he had to go rewind. So it wasn't like he had 8 hours on and 8 hours off.
Yes and no. So her question is, what was the nature of the amount of watch standing a lighthouse keeper had to do? In those early days, we typically had 4 lighthouse keepers. So there were 4 houses or 4 duplex things and all. Typically 4 lighthouse keepers, and they typically stood 4-hour watches. And typically the lighthouse was only on at night. In times of storm, it could be on day and night. And if they had to run the foghorns as well, then 2 lighthouse keepers had to be on watch. So when the lighthouse keeper had to wind that weight back up, typically he only had to do it once on a watch.
And then somebody else did it.
Then somebody else relieved him and had to do the next one. Yes, ma'am.
Yes, sir. I just want to know, I went there many years ago, and there was a double rainbow, my friend called me, and I don't remember, I heard this, when they had gotten the lens back, they evidently, it came back, and they put it in that little, they showed the kids, like a little museum, a little room. Actually, do you know, because they said they were working on it, that's what they told me.
They removed the lens for 2 reasons. she's asked him when and why did they remove the lens from the tower and bring it down to what amounts to a little museum at the light station. They brought it down for two reasons. It was a lot of weight up in the tower, that broken tower, and so they wanted to bring it down to keep the tower from disintegrating quicker. The second reason, of course, was to bring it down where people could appreciate it. Now, you mentioned the rainbow colors. You know, any prism frequently will create a rainbow spectrum of light. When they built the lenses with prisms for lighthouses, they picked a particular kind of glass that minimized that separation of colors, because what they really wanted was white light coming out of those prisms. And so even though in the fog signal building where the lens exists, you can see some of that rainbow, but not very much. Yes, ma'am.
I might have missed it, but what's used now to warn ships?
Oh, no, you didn't miss it. Lighthouses, either the lights or the foghorns are not as important as they used to be. And so the fact that the Pigeon Point Lighthouse is quiet and no light is not really terribly bad nowadays, because navigation devices are ever so much better. You know, they have GPS and they have radar and things of that sort. But I will say this, the lighthouse still performs a function. I'll tell you a story. 100 years ago, a ship was wrecked 13 miles off Pigeon Point, and the crew got into a rowboat, and they rowed through the night towards the Pigeon Point Light, and they saved themselves by doing that. Now, that story could have been last night, assuming that the light was on last night, but it's not. But my point is that the light served a purpose, even in modern times. Imagine if you were on a sailboat sailing up and down the coast, and you don't have any electronics on board. Well, then the light helps you then. When I was in the Navy, and when we navigated from place to place, we used everything at our that we had available. So we would shoot the stars with a sextant, and we would use what we at the time was Loran, not GPS, and we would take bearings on lighthouses, and even the south tower of the Golden Gate Bridge and the north windmill in Golden Gate Park. And we would take bearings on those to determine where we were. So they used everything they had available, because you never know when the one you want to depend on isn't working. So lighthouses still perform a function, not as important as they used to be. Okay, well, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, storyteller. I just want to remind everybody that you can see that lens, that very lens, in the fog signal building at Pigeon Point. So go there and you will walk in and you will say, wow, I guarantee it. And you can buy these books in the bookstore there.